Today, what we will discuss about is the dual chamber Abbott pacemaker, and I think so. We're going to click on parameters. You see parameters, and you see the different screen, and we're going to see each of this screen how to program the main parameters. Now, here, the program is the pacemaker is programmed with the nominal values. I will explain, I think, what is important to know for each of these parameters, and what are the parameters that we systematically modify from the nominal values. And then at the end, we will have a look to typical Abbott tracing, pacemaker Abbott tracing. So if you click on basic operation, you see, first of all, the first point that you need to program, the main point to program, of course, in a pacemaker is the modes. You see, you have access to these different modes. You see that you can program the pacing off. You see, pacing off. Sometimes it's interesting to program this. Let's say, for example, if you are implanted with a dual chamber pacemaker, and for any reason you want to implant, for example, a Micra leadless pacemaker, then you have the possibility to program it off, the pacemaker completely off. There is one thing, be careful that at the end of service, really at the end of life of the device, even if you have programmed it off, there may be, it's not in all the devices, but there may be a backup pacing. You see VVI backup pacing at 67 beats per minute. So, but you know that you can program it off. Sometimes an epicardial pacemaker is implanted, and for any reason you want to implant a pacemaker, classical, traditional pacemaker with endovenous lead, and you want to deprogram the epicardial pacemaker without extracting it, you have the possibility to program it pacing off. But remember that really at the end of the device, end of service, you may have a backup pacing VVI, 67 beats per minute. Okay. Okay, go out of this. Yes, V triggering, you have the possibility to program the trigger modes in some very specific conditions. You see, if you click on it, you can program it VVT. Well, it's quite unusual, but that's a possibility. So if you come back to DDD, you can program the VVT, for example, in case of oversensing, and when you can solve the solution, programming the sensing, the sensitivity, sometimes you need to program VVT. So go back to basic operation. The magnet response, if you click on it, there's two possibilities, either a battery test or off. If you re-click on battery test, something important, if you go out of this, click out, go out, and you on episode setting, here episode triggers, if you click on it, magnet response nominally is low. What does it mean? That's something important. If in some laboratory, the nurses, when they record an ECG in a patient implanted with a pacemaker, they apply a magnet, not in all the centers, but in some centers, a magnet on the device, and then you will have the acceleration. Remember that if it is programmed nominally, low means that when you will apply a magnet on the pacemaker, for 10 seconds, there's going to be a recording of the tracing. So you will record the tracing, and then after these 10 seconds, you will have the acceleration, you know, between 100 beats per minute when it's new to 105 to 85 beats per minute when the device is old. But remember that the response with the acceleration, you will need to wait for 10 seconds. So sometimes the nurses are a bit surprised. So it's on like this nominally. Usually I program it off because I don't see really the interest to have a systematic recording of an EGM when you apply a magnet. There is one situation when the patient is symptomatic and you cannot record anything, there is nothing in the memory. What you can say to the patient is that, okay, I will give you a magnet, and when you are symptomatic, you will apply the magnet on your pacemaker, and then you will have a recording, systematic recording of DGM. And in some very specific situation, it could give you the diagnosis of the problem. The other thing that you can reprogram is the V noise reversion mode. The point here is to say that anytime the device will detect an episode of noise like 50 hertz in France, 50 hertz. If there is a 50 hertz, then it will modify the pacing mode and it will systematically pace asynchronously to avoid any inhibition in case of oversensing of this noise. If you close it, okay, and if you're on episode setting also, click on episode setting, you see that you can record an EGM also when there is a noise reversion, but it is off nominally. Usually I do not program it systematically, but for any reason, for example, if one patient says, I'm going to work in this condition, I don't know if there are going to be any interference. If you want to know, and if you want to see an EGM during interference, you can program it. You can ask for the device to systematically record an EGM if there is a noise. Okay, so go back to the screen. Yes, basic operation. The sensor is, of course, very important. Nominally, it's programmed on passive. So, this is an accelerometer. There is only one sensor in Abbott device and no ventilation minute or this kind minute ventilation, just the accelerometer. So 3 choices: off, passive, or active. If you click on it, passive, yes. Yes, passive, on or off. It's nominally on passive, and I would recommend to really let it like this. If you don't want any sensor, let's consider a patient with AV block. When in sinus rhythm, you will program DDD without the sensor. I would recommend to let the sensor on passive because many algorithms will depend about the sensor. And for example, for this given patient, with AV block, if you program it off the sensor, then you will not have the possibility to have the rate adaptive function if the patient is in atrial fibrillation with an automatic mode switch. So, as I said, either you program DDD-R with the sensor active, or I will let the sensor as passive because you will have the diagnosis and you will have many algorithms that will work directly with the information coming from the sensors. So now if you want to optimize how to program the sensor, you see there are, I think, I will say three parameters that you can reprogram if you consider that there is not enough or there is too much acceleration when the sensor is programmed on. The first parameter that you can modify is the threshold. The threshold is very important, and one thing you need to understand is that the lowest the value, the more acceleration. It means that the lowest the value, if it's programmed, for example, on 0 or 1, you will have more acceleration than if it is programmed on 5 or 6, because these parameters define the amount of motion of exercise that will trigger the acceleration. So the lowest, you will react to very low amplitude signals, so you will have more acceleration. Nominally, it's programmed on auto plus 0. Auto means that perpetually, the device will analyze the last 18 hours, 1818. It means that it will measure the mean value of the activity during these are rolling windows of 18 hours. It will analyze the mean value of the exercise, and then it will systematically adapt the sensor according to this information on the last 18 hours. Sometimes, and that's something that I do quite systematically in all the old patients that are not very active, when you program it like this, auto plus 0, I think sometimes there is not enough acceleration. So what I quasi systematically modify in all the patients directly at the implantation, I program it like that, auto minus 0.5. So minus 0.5, it means that it will measure auto and then it will decrease the value by 0.5. So the device is more reactive, the threshold is higher, and then you will have more acceleration. So that's one of the things that I systematically modify in all the patients, the old patient at least, that when I require the sensor on. The second parameter, sometimes I modify, but is the slope. So this is now the other way around. It means that the higher the value of the slope, the more acceleration. Okay, so if you have a higher value of the slope, the acceleration will be steeper, and if it is a lower value, the acceleration will be flatter. Traditionally, so nominally, it's programmed on auto +2. I do not modify it systematically. I just modify it if the patient, I consider the patient the response is not enough. Sometimes I have to increase this value to make the device more reactive for the same amount of exercise. Okay. So that's about it. Remember, all the time, the sensor, I will say on passive or on. I never program it off because a lot of algorithms depend on the fact that the sensor has been activated. So go out. Now, if you click on the rate, the rest rate, it is a particularity, the rest rate in Abbott, because it's not a question of time of the day. On the other devices, you will say, okay, I want to decrease the rate when the patient is at rate. And the fact systematically, the pacemaker will decrease the rate between, let's say, for example, 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. The advantage is to decrease the rate. Maybe it will save a little of consumption of the battery because you will pace slower than when the patient is active. In Abbott, it's different. It's not a question of time. It's a question of sensor. One more. You see, the sensor is very important in the Abbott devices. So when the sensor defines that you are at rest, it will do an analysis of your activity during 1 week. And according to this data, it will define what is considered as rest or exercise. And when you are at rest, after 15 minutes or 20 minutes of rest, then it will systematically decrease whatever the day it is. It can be in the morning, the afternoon, at night. But when the device considers that you're at rest, after 15 to 20 minutes, then it will systematically decrease the rate up to the rest rate if you have programmed it. Okay, the idea for the device is to obtain at least 30% of the time, 30% of the time during the day at this rest rate. Okay, so this is the idea for the device. At the end, you want to obtain 30% of the time at 50 beats per minute if it is programmed like that. What you need to know in a device also is the capacity in terms of max sensor rate. Here it's 180. And more importantly, in terms of max tracking rate, it is important in young patients, for example, you can pace up to 210 bits per minute. No, for the max tracking rate. No, it's not 210? Okay, so it depends on...
I have to change a parameter that modify this because just before it was 210.
Okay, so you have modified something, I don't know where, but remember that in this kind of device, you can program up to 210 bits per minute. Okay, if you click it off, okay, whatever, close it, yes. Okay, so come back to the rates. Something which is a bit difficult to understand is the hysteresis settings. If you click it on, please. Okay, like this, this is a typical hysteresis. It means that the point is to decrease as much as possible the amount of atrial pacing. So you will try to decrease the rate up to 50 beats per minute. So that's a hysteresis. The point is to decrease the amount of atrial pacing. But you see there is a part on the right side. If you click on an intervention rate, let's say 80 beats per minute, for example, or something like this. Yes, anyone, click on it. Okay, so that's completely different here. The idea here is this is the algorithm you want to program when you suspect vasovagal syncope with sudden drop. What it means is that if at one time you arrive to 40 beats per minute because of sudden drop in the heart rate, then the patient will be paced at 90 beats per minute. So I never program this kind of algorithm, because in many patients, if you program it like that, you will have something that the patient will be paced quite fast at 90 beats per minute. Okay, if there is a decrease in the rate, if at one time is at 40 beats per minute, then the effect is that it will be paced at 90 beats per minute. So most of the time, I do not program this kind of algorithm. Okay, so remember, if you program intervention rate on off, program it off, then this is now the typical hysteresis. That's the algorithm classical to decrease the amount of atrial pacing. But if you program intervention rate on, then the result is that most of the time, you will have the reverse effect, and then the patient will be paced quite fast. And I don't think that's a good idea for many patients. Okay, so if you close it. Now, if you click on the delays, so the nominal value is quite high in Abbott devices. It's 200 milliseconds for the pace AV delay and 150 for the sense AV delay. You have the possibility to program the rate responsive AV delay. The idea is to decrease the duration of the AV delay during exercise. Remember, that's the same, as I said, the sensor is very important. This algorithm is not based on the acceleration of the spontaneous atrial activity, but this algorithm is based on the information coming from the sensor. If the sensor says you are active, then you will have a decrease in the duration of the AV delay. And the decrease will start at 60 beats per minute. In the old devices, this decrease in AV delay started at 90 beats per minute, but that's a detail. But remember, once more, the decrease in the duration of the AV delay will be based on the information coming from the sensor. If you're very active, you will have an important decrease in the AV delay. If you're not very active, you will have a less decrease in the AV delay. Okay. Something important that we have seen previous week is the VIP. There is no specific modes in Abbott devices to decrease the amount of avoidable right ventricular pacing in patients with preserved conduction between the atrium and the ventricle. The thing that you can program is this hysteresis, the VIP. You can program it on. There are different parameters that you can program. The extension. So remember that you cannot, at the end, program a longer AV delay more than 450 milliseconds, whatever how you program it. The search interval between 30 seconds and 30 minutes, nominally it's 1 minute. It means that's, and the search cycles 1, 2, or 3. So these are the 3 parameters. The idea is that if it's programmed like that, for 3 cycles, it will prolong the AV delay of a duration of 200 milliseconds additional with what you have programmed as AV delay. If the AV delay is programmed at 150, you will add 200 milliseconds. At the end, it's going to be 350 milliseconds. So for 3 bits, it will program it like that. And it will search every 30 seconds if you program it like that. Okay, so remember this value of 450 milliseconds. Something important also, if there is an exercise, it will stop the search if the heart rate is more than 110 beats per minute. So that's something that is important in terms of 2-to-1 block rate. You see on the screen on the left that there is an information about the 2-to-1 block rate. You see on every of the screen dealing with the modes or the delays or the PVARP, you will see this information. So you see that the way it is programmed, you will obtain a 2-to-1 block rate at 185. So that's something important to know, particularly in young patients. There is also what is called the negative AV hysteresis. So here, we don't use it too much today, but this algorithm was designed initially for patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. You know that to decrease the gradients of pressure inside the left ventricle, We don't do it too much today, but 20 years ago, we have implanted some patient with dual chamber pacemaker to decrease symptomatic patient, to decrease the gradients. And to decrease it, you need to create desynchrony. So you need to pace the right ventricle. You need to be sure to pace, to assure pacing and capture. So the negative AV hysteresis is just the opposite of the VIP. Here, you want to pace and you want to capture. So the point is that anytime you will detect intrinsic activity, you will systematically decrease the duration of the AV delay to obtain pacing with complete capture. It can be used also for resynchronization, but here in dual chamber pacemaker, the main indication was the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but obviously we do not implant, at least in Bordeaux, a patient for this kind of indication. Okay, close it. Now, if you move to capture and sense. So this is the nominal value once more. You see that you have three options for the atrium. It can be off, monitor, or on. Monitor means that there's going to be a systematic measurement of the threshold, but without adaptation. If it is on, click on, please. So this is for the ACAP confirmer. Here it's for the atrium. If you click on automatic capture settings, yes. So you need for this, for the ACAP confirm, you need a bipolar lead for sure. It will work only with bipolar leads. There are not many parameters that you can program. If it is programmed on, the margin is non-programmable. The margin depends on the measured thresholds. If I will not give you all the values, but if the threshold is less than 1.5 volts, then the margin is going to be 1 volt. And if the threshold is higher than 1.5, then you will have an increase of the margin, but you cannot program the margin. It is an auto threshold. It means that you will measure the threshold. You have two possibilities, every 8 hours or every 44 hours, once a day or 3 times a day. And then there's going to be an adaptation for the next 8 hours or for the next 24 hours. So there are not many parameters that you can program. If you program it for the ventricle, also for the ACAP confirm, the threshold is performed with measuring directly the evoked response. It's not an indirect measurement of the threshold, it's a real measurement of the threshold with analysis of the difference between the spike and the signal after. So it's quite precise in most of the time, I would say. For the ventricle, if you program it on, you see, you cannot say monitor in the ventricle. It's either off or on. Okay, you take it all or you take nothing. At the level of the atrium, what you can ask is, for example, to program it monitor. So you will see during the interrogation the value of the threshold, but without adaptation. So that's for the atrium. For the ventricle, it's either on or off. If you program it on, it can work both with unipolar or ventricular or bipolar leads. What you will need to program is the backup pulse configuration. Nominally, I think it's unipolar. Nope. Yes, I would say it's unipolar, but you can modify and program it to bipolar because the backup pulse configuration, you will pace with high amplitude, 5 volts. So in unipolar pacing, some patients are symptomatic; they can feel the backup pacing. So in this patient, if the lead is bipolar, of course, I will program it as bipolar. The same, you can program the search interval, 8 hours or 24 hours. And you can program also the AV delay. The difficulty for measuring the threshold is the occurrence of fusion between the intrinsic activity and the pacing. So usually, I let it like that with very short AV delay to decrease as much as possible the possibility of fusion. You see that you cannot program the margin. It's a bit by bit verification. So it's auto capture here. So you will perform the threshold, you will adapt the amplitude, but at every cycle, the device will check that there is a complete capture. And if not, it will reperform a threshold. Okay, so there bit by bit verification of the efficacy of the capture, and the margin in the Abbott device is 0.25 volt. So it's very low compared to all the other companies. It's very, very precise. So 0.25 volts. If you go out of this, something also important is that you can program the pulse width. This is the only algorithm where you can program the pulse width at any value that you want. Okay, you can increase this value, for example. This is not the case for all the other companies. Okay, so remember once more, ACAP confirm auto thresholds. You perform the threshold every 8 hours or 24 hours, but then you will not verify bit by bit that this is efficient. At the level of the ventricle, you will perform the threshold at every 8 hours or 24 hours, but there's going to be a verification cycle by cycle. It's auto capture verification that you are capturing. And for the atrium and the ventricle, the margins are not programmable. Something that I modify now about sensing, you see that it's like this. Auto sense is off and off at the level of the atrium and the ventricle. It means that this is a fixed sensitivity. So at the level of the atrium, for example, it's 0.5 millivolts fixed. And at the level of ventricle, it's 2 millivolts. Usually, I do not modify the sensibility at the level of the ventricle, particularly if the patient is in AV block, for example. Because if you program it on, you need to be cautious. If you click there, you see that the level of the sensitivity is very high. It's exactly like in an ICD, but the problem that you can encounter in a pacemaker and an ICD are different. In an ICD, you want to detect a ventricular fibrillation, and the main task for a pacemaker is not to be inhibited in case of oversensing. So the question about sensitivity are clearly different in a pacemaker and a defibrillator. If you program it on like this, with 0.5 millivolt at the level of the ventricle, now you become to be very sensitive. And I think there is an important risk, I would say, of oversensing of any signals, diaphragmatic myopotentials or T-wave or this kind of thing. It's not frequent, T-wave or sensing with a pacemaker, but this is not the way I program it usually. So if you come back, okay, click. So I will let auto sense on off. And at the level of the atrium, either I program, I like that, but I modify the level of sensitivity. If I program it fixed, usually I program 0.3 millivolts because sometimes with 0.5, you may have problems in case of atrial fibrillation. So problems of undersensing or undersensing of atrial fibrillation. So at the level of atrium, I either program it like this or I program it on. Yes, auto, and then you see with the same level of the sensitivity of 0.3 millivolt, I think it's a bit better for a correct diagnosis of atrial fibrillations. Okay. Out for the leads, nothing particular. No, maybe okay. Click out. Yep. And for the refractories and blanking, what can I say? The rate responsive PVARP, once more, it's based on the indications coming from the sensor, not about the rate. It's a question of sensor, if the sensor is passive or on. And then the more active you will be, the less the more you will have a reduction of the duration of the PVARP. So now the PVARP duration and the AV delay duration works together, and the point, of course, is to obtain the highest level for the 2-to-1 block rate. Okay, so once more, you see the information on your screen. When you will modify anything, you will see the direct impact on the 2-to-1 block rate, for example. You see, you have modified now the rate responsive PVARP, and then you see the direct impact on 2-to-1 block rate. Okay, so I think it is an important information to understand, and you will better understand the impact of your programming on this very important point in patients with AV block. See if
you hear me?
Yes.
At the beginning, I show you max tracking rate. It was only 180, and
Yes.
it's because the 2-to-1 rate was 185. You cannot fix a max tracking rate above
Yeah, sure.
The 2-to-1 block, and there is something here to modify with a lower PVARP to get a higher.
Well, when we were discussing initially on the capacity of the device in terms of maximal tracking rate, I say that for this kind of device, it will be 210 bits per minute. But there is a law. You cannot program a maximal tracking rate less than the 2-to-1 block. You will not have this possibility. You see, anytime you will modify the 2-to-1 block rate, it will also modify the maximal tracking rate directly. Okay, so if you click now on additional settings, you see, yeah, okay, additional settings. What can I say here? The ventricular blanking, this one is the blanking post-atrial pacing. If you click on it, usually I program it as a fixed value. I program it, the nominal value is 44 milliseconds, and I let it like that. It's a bit complicated to explain the functioning on the auto, but usually I let it the ventricular blanking like that. The ventricular safety standby is quite short in Abbott. It means that if you program it like that, you will have 40. Once you pace the atrium, at the level of the ventricle, you will have 44 milliseconds of ventricular blanking, and then the safety window will be from 44 to 64 milliseconds. Well, these are details and not very important, I'm saying. At least I will let it like on for the ventricular safety standby. The PVC response, the idea is to prolong the PVARP when there is a detection of the PVC. So the PVARP will be automatically prolonged up to 475 milliseconds. And then you will have a sequence of atrial pacing, whatever. But you see, you have the possibility in your device to record the PMT. If you close it and close episode settings, you see, if you click it, it's off nominally. But you can ask the device to record a PMT when there are episodes of PMT. You need to be cautious because if you program it like that, you may not see some episode of automatic. It's a competition between all the diagnoses. So if you program the PMT on, usually you see atrial episode, I will program it as I. So you can be, because I think the priority is to see the episode of atrial fibrillation. So if you program it like that, you will both have episode of PMT and episode of atrial episodes of atrial fibrillation. But if you program the recording of the PMT, if for any reason, I will show you a tracing after, but if after a PMT, if the PMT is induced by a PVC, then I will program the PVC response on. Okay? If you have episode of PMT induced by a PVC, then I will program the algorithm on. What I systematically modify also is the PMT detection rate. Well, I program it at 110 bits per minute, like this, because then you have more chance to record the episode of PMT. So that's something I systematically modify. Nominally, it's 130. I'm used to program it at 110 bits per minute. Okay. Okay, at 80 AF. That's also something I'd modify. You can like the auto mode switch. You can see the sensor. You see, for example, in a patient with AV block, I will program it as DDD with the sensor on passive and auto mode switch with DDIR. Okay, of course, in patient with AV block, you want to have the sensor when the patient had atrial fibrillation and with automatic mode switch. Something that usually I modify, you see nominally it's 80 bits per minute, the base rate. So if there is a switch to DDIR, the rate will be 80 bits per minute. Usually I program it as 70 bits per minute because 80 may be a bit too elevated. So you can close. So for example, what I do systematically in a patient once he's implanted, let's consider it's a patient with sinus node dysfunction. I will program the VIP. I will deprogram the fact to record a tracing when I apply the magnets. I will decrease the rate when there is an automatic mode switch. the sensitivity, atrial sensitivity, I will let it on fixed, and I will decrease the value from 0.5 to 0.3. And that's about it. On the episode settings, I ask for the recording of the PMT, and I deprogram the fact that I want once more an EGM when I apply a magnet. Because in some patients, you see many of these episodes. I don't know, for any reason, some cardiologists systematically apply a magnet on the device, and you will see many episodes recorded. I don't think it's very interesting to see that. Okay, any question? Yes, on the EGM, something important also on the stored EGM. If it's a dual chamber pacemaker, you see that systematically when you will record an EGM, there's going to be two channels, A sense amp, V sense amp. I do not modify A sense amp and V sense amp because these are the working channels. But remember, you can add a third channel, but the more channels, the less duration of the episode you will have. If you program, for example, the leadless ECG to better understand how it works, then you see you will have the possibility a storage of 5 minutes. If you program just two channels, click on 2, up, then the storage is 8, and if you program on 1, the storage will be 14 minutes. You see, so depending on the level of information you will ask for, the more or the less duration of storage you will have. So that's something quite important, because sometimes if there are many episodes of PMT, mode switch, noise, anything like that, at the end you can lose a lot of information. Okay, for the MRI, maybe the last thing, what was specific for Abbott devices was the fact that there was an activator. See here, we have never used it personally in Bordeaux, but I don't know, maybe in your centers you were using the activator. You could ask, you needed to program setup MRI activator if you click on it. Okay, continue. There were different things to do. Systematically, you had to confirm the quality of the threshold, and then also in terms of impedance. And then you could click on that, and then you could enable the activator. It means that when the patient was factually inside the MRI or just before starting the MRI, you just had to place the activator on the device. For example, the radiologist could place the activator on the device and activate it, and then systematically it will activate the MRI mode at this time. And then once the MRI was finished, then the radiologist could re-applicate the activator on the device and then ask for come back to the traditional pacing mode. Okay. So any question on the programming of Abbott's devices? Any question? Nope. At the end, when you have the nominal values, you don't need to change too many parameters. I think it's quite correct like this. You will, of course, adapt the maximal tracking rate according to the characteristics of the patients, but you see, not so many parameters that I systematically modify after implantation. Any question? Nope. So now, I'm sorry, there is an helicopter, so it's going to be a bit noisy. Yann, are you there? Yann Charton, are you there?
Yes.
Yes, Yann. What do you think about this? So I'm sorry it's in French, but it's about the same. Huh?
Yep. So it's a double chamber pacemaker.
Yes.
It's a recorded EGM.
Yes.
It's programmed in DDD.
Yes.
And we see on the beginning of the tracing.
It's Janos.
Go ahead. Yes.
We see a sense, spontaneous atrial signal, and the same at ventricle in the ventricle.
Oh, this is an episode of PMT recorded.
And
TRE means in French it's PMT. So it is an episode of PMT. Okay. So what do you see?
Yes. Yes, and on the beginning of the tracing, we can see that VIP is not. We have the marker VIP, which is the hysteresis delay mode for conduction preservation,
okay.
and so we can see that AV delay is gonna be longer.
Okay. So what happens here?
And we can see a PVC with retrograde activation.
Well, yes, probably. It's very likely that this is the retrograde activation. And then
another one.
Another one. So you see the second one. Okay.
And it will start the PMT with IS V-pace.
Yes, so this one is outside the refractory period, this atrial activity. So yes, that's the interest here of programming the PVC response. You see, this is a PVC because there is no AS or AP before. That's ventricular spontaneous activation without AS or AP. So we will consider it as a PVC. And if you have programmed here the algorithm, PVC response, you will systematically prolong the PVARP up to 475 milliseconds. So this one will be AR and there will not be any PMT, okay? So you see that there are two PVCs here and the VIP. VIP, what it means that you will have a prolongation, you see, of the AV delay. It's quite long here. And PVC, desynchronization between the ventricle and the atrium, long AV delay. So it will promote the retrograde conduction on the next cycles also, okay? So you see that the VIP has been programmed at 3 beats here, 1, 2, 3, and then you come back to the short and normal AV delay, but you have been initiation, you have seen here an initiation of the PMT, and after 8 cycles, you see, how does it work now?
The PMT algorithm?
Yes.
Yes, I think it's gonna prolong the PVARP to a longer period.
Nope. And, no. The first thing is that it will have to differentiate between a sinus tachycardia and a PMT. So it will modify the AV delay. You see, it's 170 beats per minute, and on this one, it's 220 milliseconds. You see, you have prolonged here the AV delay. And then you will analyze the next atrial cycles. If it is a PMT, if you delay the ventricular pacing, you will delay the atrial signals also. If it's a sinus tachycardia, if you modify the AV delay, it will have no impact on the occurrence of the next atrial cycle, okay? And you see that the atrial cycle were 450 milliseconds. And if you prolong the AV delay, you also delay the occurrence of the atrial signal. So this is a PMT. And it's not a question of prolongation then of PVARP. So diagnosis of PMT, you will not synchronize ventricular pacing on this cycle. So it's AS, but without ventricular pacing. The thing that will do the device is then to pace the atrium and the ventricle after 330 milliseconds, okay? So diagnosis of PMT, suspicion first. This is now the proof that this is a PMT because I have prolonged the AV delay and then I've delayed the atrial signals, meaning that the atrial signals depend on the ventricular pacing. Diagnosis of PMT. And to stop it, I do not synchronize ventricular pacing on these atrial signals. And then I will restart with atrial pacing, ventricular pacing, and then stop the end of the PMT. Okay? Good. Can you explain me a little? This is very particular to Abbott devices, so I will show you. Explain the automatic mode switch. You see here, it's episode entrée cam. It means episode of automatic mode switch because of diagnosis of atrial fibrillation. So do you know how it works in Abbott devices? Any idea?
Yes. I think it's gonna count like there is a counting of on atrial signals, which will be I don't know how to say.
Yeah, you know, in all the other devices, the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation is based on a certain percentage of cycles that are considered fast. You see. You would say, for example, in Biotronic, 5 out out of 8 short cycles at the level of the atrium, and then you will have automatic mode switch. This is for biotronic, for example. Here, it's based on something a bit difficult to understand. It is called the FARI, so filtered atrial rate interval. The point is that there is impermanence analysis of the atrial rate. And you will have what is called the filtered atrial rate. It means that anytime you will have a short cycles, your filtered atrial rate will decrease by, let's say, something like 40 milliseconds. Anytime you will have a long cycle, this rate will increase by 20 milliseconds. So like this is a real episode of atrial fibrillation, you agree? So every time you will have a short cycle, so all the cycles are considered short here, you will decrease the filtered atrial rate by 40 milliseconds. So you will decrease by 40, 80, 120, 160, 200. And when you will arrive to the value where you have programmed the automatic switch, it will switch. Okay, let's consider you have considered that the rate for switching in case of atrial fibrillation is 200 beats per minute at the level of the atrium. It means this is an interval of 300 milliseconds. So your filtered atrial rate will decrease by 40 milliseconds, 40, 40, 40, 40, 40. When you arrive to 300 milliseconds, automatic mode switch. Okay, you understand? It's clear or not?
Yes.
Yes. So that's now, this is an episode of atrial fibrillation, a real one. What do you think about this one? So that's the same. Automatic mode switch. You see?
Yes. And so we have as pace and another sensing on the atrial channel.
Yeah. Clearly, what you see at the level of the atrial signal here, this is the atrial channel, ampli detect. So this is the working algorithm for the atrium and the ventricle. And you see that you have a sharp signal and then a smooth, a sharp, a smooth. So alternance between two signals. And I think that you're right. This is clearly oversensing of the ventricular activation at the level of the atrial channel. So something like a far field R wave of sensing, okay, post-pacing, alternance. But if you remember the algorithm, as I said, yes, this is going to be a short cycle, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. So if you consider the filtered atrial rate, it will decrease by 40 milliseconds, increase by 20, decrease by 40, increase by 20. So with the alternance, every 2 cycles, you will decrease by 20 milliseconds, 40 minus 20. Okay, so if there is this kind of oversensing, at the end, you will have automatic mode switch. Okay, if there is a systematic oversensing of the ventricular pacing at the level of the atrial channel, you will have automatic mode switch. Okay, so that's a limitation of this algorithm. Because if there is oversensing, far field, or this kind of thing, then you will have this problem. Something a bit more surprising here. What do you think? So once more, episode of automatic mode switch. What do you think here?
First part is aphasia pace.
And you see this? It means that there is a signal here. This signal has been detected. And something interesting in Abbott devices, you can see the refractory periods. And these are the ventricular refractory periods, and these are the atrial one. So you see that this signal, where it is here, it is here. Yep. It is where? In which period?
In the relative pivot, in the pivot?
In the pivot, yes. This is in the pivot. You see here, when you pace the atrium, there is a blanking. And then when you pace the ventricle, at the level of the atrium, there is a blanking also. So the PVAB here. But your signal has been detected inside the PVAB. Okay? You agree with that? So there is no marker, but here it should be AR. It means that it has been detected and there is oversensing. You see here, it should be AR. Just like here, you see AR? Mm-hmm. Here you just have this, but you should have AR, okay? That's something you need to know. Just one point. In this situation, what would you do?
I think I might prolong the absolute blanking.
Yes, you would like to prolong the PVAB. It means that you will prolong the actual blanking post-ventricular pacing. You see, it ends just here, so it's just before the signal. So if you prolong it by 20 milliseconds, I think this is going to be in the PVAB, and then no problem of oversensing. Okay. So here, what is surprising is that you have a succession alternance between AP oversensing, AP oversensing, and you see that at the end, you see there is automatic mode switch. This is the only company where you can have inappropriate automatic mode switch in case of alternance between AP and AR, AP and R. You see, that's surprising, and that this has been modified in the new pacemakers. Now, in the new pacemaker, when there is a succession AP, AR, AP, AR, AP, and R, you will not have any automatic mode switch in this situation, because if there is an alternance between AP and AR, that cannot be atrial fibrillation, of course.
Yes.
Atrial fibrillation, you will only have spontaneous signals. That's clear. So this has been modified now in the new devices. Okay, that was a bit surprising, I would say. I just show you this because this is not unusual with Abbott leads. In Abbott leads, you may have some noises like this. If you're used to do remote monitoring, you will see that patients implanted with Abbott leads, it's a question, I think, of insulation. You may have a lot of this kind of oversensing. That's not unusual at all. And at the end, you may have a lot of false episodes of automatic mode switch. Can happen also inside the ventricle. If you implant the same kind of lead inside the ventricle, you may have problems of oversensing and then episode of fast ventricular episode because of false diagnosis of ventricular tachycardia because of the noise. That's not unusual with this kind of leads. I just show you, you see here, this is an episode of 2-to-1 blank flutter. It means that this is a flutter. You see the actual signals here are fast, very regular, and every other signal falls inside the blanking, the actual blanking following ventricular pacing. When you program these parameters, the actual blanking following ventricular pacing, the PVAB, if you're programming long, you will decrease the risk of what you have seen just before, the problem of oversensing of the far-field RF signals. But be careful, if you program long, you may have this kind of problem in some patients. The longer this blanking, the more the risk of 2-to-1 blank flutter. So it's a balance between you want it long enough not to have the problem of far-field RF sensing, but if it's too long, then you will increase the risk if the patient is in flutter to see this kind of problem, 2-to-1 blank flutter. But there is an algorithm of protection inside the device now. And when you will detect this kind of problems, you will systematically on 1 bit reduce the duration on the blanking if there is a suspicion of 2-to-1 blanking flutter, and then it may solve the problem. This is an algorithm that you can disable, you cannot disable. It's inside the device and it works like that. Okay. And I show you the last tracing. What do you think here? You're still there, Jan?
Yes.
So once more, it's an episode of detection of atrial fibrillation. And that's a particularity of Abbott devices. What do you think here?
Yes, I think it's sense activity.
So it's APVP at the level of the sensor. And then what happened here?
And there is a PVC.
Yes. With spontaneous atrial activation, but inside the PVARP, you see, following the VS.
Yes.
And then after.
Okay. And then after we have APVP and another one, and it's gonna track the this. It's like a non-reentrant IV synchrony. It's
repeat. I never know the name in English, but it's repetitive non-reentrant atrioventricular synchrony. You see?
Yes.
You see the problem here? This patient has a retrograde conduction. There is a PVC, retrograde conduction. you see that the sensor is activated. Since the sensor is activated, remember that a signal that is labeled AR will not inhibit atrial pacing. So you're going to be paced at the level of the atrium at the rate indicated by the sensor without inhibition by this signal. So AP is very close to this one, maybe too close. So it's in the refractory period of the atrial myocardium. So you will not capture here. Since you're not capturing, you will deliver AP, VP, but you're not capturing. So there is quite a duration from this signal to this ventricular pacing. So there is a possibility of retrograde conduction. And it's going to be repetitive like that. It means that VP, retrograde conduction, then AP at the rate given by the sensor without capturing, VP, retrograde conduction, and so on. And you see that what was very particular to Abbott devices, it's not that you had more episodes of this kind of things in Abbott, but you were recording this episode because at the end, there was a false diagnosis of atrial fibrillation. Remember that in all the other devices, if any other two of the signals is AP, there will not be any kind of diagnosis of atrial fibrillation. But in the Abbott devices, at least in the old ones, you could see the episodes. And how would you solve the problem here?
If I may, I would stop the sensor or program.
Yes, I think this is more or less the only solution because let's say if you want this not to happen, you will require that this signal is not AR but AS. If it is AS, then it will inhibit atrial pacing and it will stop. But if it is AS, then there is a risk of what?
Of I'm sorry. Of PMT. Yes.
You understand? One of the solutions could be to decrease the duration of the PVARP. But if you decrease the duration of the PVARP, then the signal will be AS, and then there is a risk of PMT. Okay? So the only solution here to solve the problem without increasing the risk of PMT in this patient with retrograde conduction is to stop the sensor. Because if you stop the sensor, then the AP will arrive later. And if you arrive later, that you will probably capture the level of the atrium, and then there's not going to be any retrograde conduction, and you will not have this kind of problems. Okay? So in this patient, remember, if there is a retrograde conduction, there is a dilemma. If the signal falls inside the PVARP, you will not have any PMT, but you may have this kind of problem. If it is outside, when there is retrograde conduction, outside the PVARP, then you will have a higher risk of PMT, but not this kind of problem. Okay? So any questions? No? Everything is clear about Abbott devices? Okay, so next week, we're going to discuss about the interest of remote monitoring in a patient implanted with a pacemaker. We're going to see, this is going to be Sylvain Ploux, and he will try to discuss with you about the potential interests of remote monitoring in patients with pacemakers. And the week after, it's going to be about biotronic devices. So we're going to do the same that for Abbott, first the interrogation and then the programming. Okay, so if there's no question, have a good week and see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.